Hello, welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How much damage is COVID-19 and the lockdown likely to do to the economy? What is the state of the economy today as recovery begins? And what are the additional steps that are critical and necessary if we're going to get back to 7 and 8% levels of growth? Those are three key issues I should take up today with the Chief India Economist of JP Morgan and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Sajjid Chinoy. Dr. Chinoy, as I said in the introduction, I want in particular to talk to you about the sort of damage the virus and the lockdowns are likely to do to the economy. I want to talk to you about the state of the economy today as recovery begins, and most importantly, about the steps you believe are necessary to take us back to 7 and 8% levels of growth. But first, let me ask you, what was the state of the economy just before COVID happened? In a recent essay you've written for Open Magazine, you say that growth was slowing discernibly over the last 3 years, and it in fact slumped to 4.2% in the year immediately before COVID happened. What and how worrisome is the full picture behind those facts?
Hi, Karan. Good to be here. Let me just start with the obvious caveat that these views are my personal views and therefore not necessarily of the council. But you're right. I think, before we look ahead, we should look back to understand the economy as it was heading into COVID. And there are two ways to cut this. If you look back over the last 6 years, average growth in India has been close to 7%, which is still very impressive, given that several emerging markets over the last 5 or 6 years have struggled. But there are two caveats. One is that, as you mentioned, we had two distinct phases. In the first 3 years of that 6-year period, growth actually accelerated very handsomely to almost 8%. In the next 3 years, it slowed quite appreciably all the way down to 4% or thereabouts before the COVID year. Now, why was that happening? I think to understand that, we have to understand what the drivers of growth were in this particular cycle and how they compare with previous cycles. India had a strong growth burst in the early 2000s as well, but that was driven by this dual combination of exports and investment. Remember, that was the time when there was hyper-globalization around the world, trade was growing much more rapidly than GDP, and India participated in that growth engine. So exports were growing at 18% a year for 7 or 8 years, and investment was responding to strong exports. We were building domestic capacities to fulfill external demand, and so you had this virtuous cycle between strong export and strong investment. Now, post the global financial crisis, we've seen a lot of deglobalization. We've seen protection go up, and so exports have fallen all around the world. And over the last 6 years, India's exports only grew at about 2.5%. Some of this had to do with the global environment. Some of this had to do with the fact that India's own exports were lagging its peers. And so instead, the growth was driven by consumption. We've had 6 years of almost 7% consumption, which again is impressive. We saw this in the FMCG story in the rural economy. We see this visibly in e-commerce in the urban economy. What's less visible is a lot of this consumption was financed by debt. Households essentially running down their savings and taking on debt as more and more of them had access to formal credit channels. So as banks began to lend and NBFCs lend to households, they began to borrow. And this was rational behavior. You were borrowing to smooth consumption over your lifetime. The problem with this approach is it works really well in the good times. But when you have a slowdown in the economy, households begin to reevaluate their long-term prospects and essentially cut back on consumption. And I suspect that's what was happening just before the COVID year, where consumption fell, both because households were getting a little bit more worried about their long-term prospects in the third year of a slowdown, but also because the financial sector had become impaired. So let me end by saying, I think there are three areas we should focus on coming into COVID. One was that consumption was slowing. Because consumption was slowing and exports were weak, investment was actually contracting. So the private sector was quite beleaguered coming into this cycle. And that's important because that will help us understand how slowly or fast it recovers post-COVID. A lot of the heavy lifting was done by government spending in the last few years. Government spending grew at twice the rate of the private sector the last 5 years. And the third and last point is the financial sector was quite risk averse coming in. And I think it's important to appreciate these three nuances because it'll help guide both the policy response and the economic outlook.
That's a very comprehensive answer. Just for those who perhaps are not economists and didn't follow it completely, what you're saying is that of the four engines of growth, three, exports, private consumption, and investment, were actually slowing down, sometimes pretty appreciably as we approached COVID. The only one that was really firing was government spending. And I take it that means that in the last 2, 3 years before COVID, the Indian economy was limping. It wasn't racing, it wasn't running, it was limping.
It was, and I think some of this had to do with the global environment. Remember, the trade war between the US and China meant there was more protection, meant exports were under some pressure. And also, I would say the financial sector had a big part to play. After the ILFS crisis in 2018, we saw the banking system become very risk averse. And credit growth had slowed appreciably. So the government was forced to do a lot of the heavy lifting coming into COVID.
Now, against this background, what do you believe will be the likely impact of both COVID and the lockdowns on growth and the economy during this first full financial year? I noticed that the State Bank of India has estimated that the economy could shrink by 6.83%. The credit ratings agency ICRA says that it will contract by 9.5%, and the former chief statistician Pranav Sen says that it could shrink by 12.5%. You study the economy very closely yourself. What's your estimate of the impact over the year?
I think a variety of estimates, both domestic and global, put the contraction somewhere between 5 and 7%. JP Morgan's own estimate is around 6.5%. But let me make 2 points. One is we won't be alone. Every economy this world, from the US to the European Union to Japan to every emerging market, is going to contract. We haven't seen these level of contraction since the Second World War. I would say more important than studying one number in India is to actually understand what the sequential momentum of growth is 2 or 3 quarters down. Because whether the economy contracts at 6% or 7% won't give us much of a sense of how quickly the recovery is beginning, because the first quarter between April and June will be very weak. And that might, cast a shadow on the full year's numbers. So the way I think about this is what we should be focused on is the COVID shock amplifying through the financial market and through the labor market? If it does amplify through these markets, then the recovery will be much more gradual, pushed out much more, and I would worry much more. If you have a very bad first quarter, April to June, but we don't see much amplification in the remaining quarters, I'd be less worried no matter what the full year number is. What is one source of amplification? I'll just make one point over here. It's bankruptcies. If a lot of economically viable firms go bankrupt, what that does is it increases non-performing assets for the financial system, makes them more risk averse. It puts more people out of a job, which has implications for consumption, and it will reduce the productive capacity of the economy. So I think the focus has to be, how do you prevent amplification more than what is the full year number?
I'll come to the amplification in a moment's time, because I think it is the big problem looming over the recovery, and it's one for which we don't have an immediate answer, or at least not an answer that's discernible. But I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me pick up on some of the other things you raised first. You spoke a bit about the financial sector. I noticed that the Financial Stability Report brought out by the RBI recently suggests that NPAs could grow to 14.7%. Separately, the chairman of the State Bank of India, Rajneesh Kumar, has told the British paper The Financial Times that struggling sectors like hotels and airlines and aviation in general could put huge pressure on public sector banks. Now, you're a banker yourself. How do you view the state of the financial sector at this moment, and how worried are you about the possibility of emerging bankruptcies?
Yeah. Well, I think the outlook for the financial sector will be critical in driving the outlook for the broader economy. So it's a key focus area. Let me say, we've come into this with a financial sector that was relatively beleaguered. Public sector banks in particular have been very risk averse. The RBI said so as well last week. And in a sense, credit growth has been slowing for several years now, and in fact has dipped below nominal GDP growth, which is not a good sign. Part of the problem has been we've been flying on one engine for a long time. There was a time where public sector banks in 2014, 15, 16 were cleaning up their bad loans, being recapitalized, resolving stressed assets. And that's when non-bank financial companies really boomed. Now, just when public sector banks were getting back to good health, you had a crisis in the NBFC sector. So in a way, we've never had both banks and shadow banks firing at the same time. Now, to be fair, as I said, the emerging threat is how do you prevent bankruptcies of economically viable firms? And to the government's credit, there have been 3 or 4 important steps announced in the last couple of months that should help in that process. One is there's been a 100% credit guarantee for lending to small, medium enterprises. The RBI has injected a ton of liquidity in the banking system, and we're finally seeing that that's causing some of the non-bank financial companies' financial conditions to become easier. They're able to borrow at lower rates of interest and are able to raise money. And the third is we had this one-time restructuring or recasting of loans. I think all of this will go some way in preventing bankruptcies. For me, the next priority, I'll just end with 2 quick points. One is capital, capital, capital. We really need to recapitalize our public sector banks soon so that they have both the resolution capital and growth capital to lend again. And when this is all done, Karan, I think we need to go back to some reforms in the financial sector to fix some of these lingering issues, whether it's an AQR for NBFCs or whether it's reducing government share below 51% in some public sector banks.
Let me pick up on something you said. You spoke of the critical importance of both the moratorium as well as the restructuring, the one-time restructuring, preventing bankruptcies. Is it actually preventing bankruptcies, or is it simply kicking the can down the road? Because there are many who are scared that when the moratorium ends, there'll be not just capital to repay, but interest to repay. And at that point, many MSMEs will be broke because they will not have been functioning. So is this a danger that's looming ahead that could make a bigger problem even worse?
There are no easy answers here. And I think all emerging markets are grappling with the same trade-off. So what is the trade-off here? Well, on the one hand, allowing banks to restructure loans means economically viable enterprises who haven't had revenues for the last 3 or 4 months, but have had to pay costs, don't go bankrupt. And therefore can stay alive to fight another day. Of course, the flip side of that is if you allow a restructuring, you also increase the odds that zombie firms stay alive, and you don't want that to happen. If there is a zombie firm, you want that bad asset to be recognized soon, resolved soon. We economists call it creative destruction. So you've got a better allocation of resources. So there's no easy answer. I would say, given the unprecedented nature of this crisis, perhaps we should err on the side of making a type 1 error, which is having a restructuring and ensuring viable firms don't go bankrupt and create the amplification. But I think the devil will be in the details. Monitoring this closely to ensure that some of the pitfalls of the last restructuring are not repeated will be important.
The second problem that exists at the moment, and again, it's one that you touch upon in your article for Open Magazine, concerns the labor market. Now I accept that the recent weekly figure put out by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy for unemployment is 8.6%, and it's a lot better than the 27.1 that we reached on the 3rd of May. But as you point out, the problem today is that tens of millions of workers have shifted from the urban to the rural economy, and we need to find a convincing way of bringing them back. That's a challenge that faces us today. They've gone. Many of them are coming back in dribs and drabs, I admit that, but the vast majority are hesitant to come.
That's right. So I think, the encouraging news is if you look at CMI surveys, both the unemployment rates, both in rural and urban, are now back to their pre-COVID levels. But we need to be careful in interpreting that, because if you account for the drop in labor force participation, the employment to population ratios, both in urban and rural, are still a couple of percentage points below where they were pre-COVID. But be that as it may, this is encouraging that we've bounced back soon. The problem is not going to be employment or unemployment. Everyone's going to find some job. The problem typically is underemployment, productivity, and wages. I think that's the key issue here. Now, to the government's credit, I think NREGA allocation has been increased sharply. That is India's only automatic stabilizer. It's important because all of these urban migrant workers have gone back to the rural economy. And what you might see is this segmented market where in the rural economy, there are too many people, excess labor, wages get bid down, productivity is down. And therefore, it's important that you have NREGA there so that it provides a form of livelihood for those who can't find jobs anywhere else. But I think it's important, as you hinted, that we have to enable the migration of labor back from the rural to the urban. How should one do that? Well, the most obvious way is when the virus abates in urban areas, if we can contain it quickly in urban areas, activity will normalize faster. Once activity normalizes, that will become a magnet. But point number two, and the last point, is we need to ensure that while NREGA provides a source of livelihood, over time, not now, it doesn't become a disincentive for labor to come back to the urban. So it's a fine balance we have to walk.
I'm still deliberately holding back that critical question, the issue you raised about the impact of the escalating crisis on the recovery, because I want to now ask you directly about the recovery that's happening before I ask you how the escalating health crisis could impact it. And let's break this recovery into two separate questions. First of all, do you believe we saw genuine green shoots in June? Or is that an overinterpretation?
Well, we should never overinterpret any one data point. Here's what we know, that as the economy began to open up, if you track an index of output, what you will notice is in the month of April, this was 40% of pre-pandemic levels. By May, it had increased to 60%, and by June, 80%. Now, we should not overinterpret that for two reasons. One is there's a lot of pent-up demand in these numbers. People were buying in June what they had wanted to buy in April and May in June. And so it was always going to be the case that the pace of recovery can continue at that pace. Secondly, it's unrealistic to expect activity to go back to 100% of pre-pandemic levels because there are many activities that are still restricted. Nobody's going to restaurants or movie theaters or malls. Schools are closed. Flights are not as aren't at the same number as they were before. I think the key is going forward, we should not conflate a V-shaped recovery in growth rates with a V-shaped recovery in the levels of output. The levels of output, getting back to pre-pandemic levels, could still take a while until we don't fully contain the virus. And I'll give you one example. We recently did a study looking at data across all of India's states to see, can we correlate mobility with virus proliferation? And you find a two-sided relationship. What do I mean by that? As mobility increases, there are more virus cases, but as virus cases go up, that dampens mobility. So really, until we don't contain the virus and households don't have the confidence to go back to the workforce or increase consumption with greater confidence, we won't be getting back to a full recovery till the virus is gone.
You gave a very good caution there. We mustn't overinterpret one data point. We mustn't conclude from the fact that there was an improvement in output between May compared to April and June compared to May, that we're fast getting back to normal. But how did the situation change in July and the first 2 weeks of August? Suddenly, a whole lot of states have declared mini or regional or haphazard lockdowns. They seem to be proliferating almost like measles, if I can say that. Has that put a brake on whatever momentum of growth we were seeing in June?
Yes, we have seen that the level of output in July remains around 80-85% on aggregate, so it hasn't improved materially from June. But this, in a way, is very heterogeneous. There are some sectors, essential goods have recovered much more fast. So in the IIP number that came out 2 days ago, what did we see? If you break consumption down into the more essential, discretionary, non-durable goods, they were at 115% of their pre-pandemic levels. If you look at durables, which are more discretionary, more lumpy, they were just at 68%. So the recovery is going to be different in different sectors, depending on how important that sector is, how essential it is, or how discretionary it is. But the fact is, you're right, we're about 80 or 85% of pre-pandemic levels. Some sectors are doing better than others, but to get back to a full recovery, as I said, we need for the virus to be contained, and we need households to be less risk averse.
Now, one area, Dr. Chinoy, which has actually shown remarkable resilience is in fact agriculture. We had a bumper Rabi harvest. Newspaper reports suggest that the area under cultivation for Kharif is around 10% more than it was last year. And the finance minister, speaking to the Hindustan Times on the 25th, went on record to say, and I'm quoting her, "We can clearly see agriculture driving the revival." And I believe she repeated that a day or two ago again. The problem is agriculture is only roughly 15% of the economy. So how much driving can it do? And how much of income in rural India derives from agriculture.
Right. No, so the one bright spot here is agriculture for two reasons. One is what you mentioned. We've had a normal monsoon. Sowing has been strong. We expect agriculture to grow between 4 and 5%. Now, in this environment, Karan, you want to look for good news wherever you can. The second factor that will help farmers in agriculture is the terms of trade. Food inflation has gone up. That hurts consumers in urban areas, but that's a source of income to farmers. So for both these reasons, a strong output, but also the terms of trade moving towards agriculture, expect agriculture to have a really good year, and that should provide some support. But as you pointed out, we should not conflate agriculture with the rural economy. Over time, agriculture constitutes about 30 or 35% of rural consumption. So a lot of where the rural economy lands up will actually depend on its connectivity with the urban area. Do we have some of the workers coming back to the urban area and sending their remittances back? And so the linkages there with urban are much greater. So you're right, agriculture will provide some offset. It will be a partial offset. But if I may, I think what excites me more about agriculture is some of the reforms that the government announced in May. I think the marketing reforms, if we take it to their logical conclusion, are truly exciting, right? So one of the existential problems with agriculture has been, we see this monopsony at the mandi, and the farmer never gets to see the price that the consumer in cities is paying. If we can truly liberalize marketing so that the transmission of price signals from urban areas to the farmer is greater, we'll get much more allocative efficiency in the agricultural sector. It will also mean that we can start exporting some of our surpluses. So how quickly we can implement those announced reforms with the states, I think, for me, is more exciting over the next few quarters for agriculture.
As you mentioned, these are reforms that will begin to have an impact not immediately, but over the next few quarters, and it depends upon the speed with which they're implemented. You picked up the market reform. Do you think the amendment of rules to permit contract or to facilitate contract farming is also important?
Yes, indeed. I think both of these are. I think both of these are important. Now, in some of these areas, as you know, the center would need to work with the states. So let's hope that the center and the states can work together, and we can push this through as soon as possible. The fact is, agriculture is 13% of GDP, but is estimated to employ about 40% of India's labor force. So the faster that we can improve agricultural productivity, the better it bodes for incomes for a lot of people in the rural economy.
I simply, for the sake of the audience, point out that at least one major agricultural state government, Punjab, is actually opposed to these reforms and contesting them, but I'm simply mentioning that for the sake of the audience. Let me now come to the issue that you brought up earlier, which I promised I would bring up later, and it's the impact the health crisis is likely to have on the recovery that's happening. You mentioned that output has increased slowly to about 80-85% of pre-COVID levels, but now it's plateaued over there. The problem is this: whatever recovery we're likely to see hereafter, until we have a reliable vaccine, will always be under threat from the escalating COVID crisis. We're pretty close to 2.5 million cases already. We're growing at over 60,000 a day. Epidemiologists have predicted that altogether, detected and undetected cases, we could have 100 million by the end of August, maybe 200 million by the end of September. What's your feeling about the recovery? What will be the impact of this continuing and escalating crisis on whatever recovery we're seeing?
Yeah. Well, Karan, this is true around the world, and it's almost tautological to say that economic prospects are going to be related or correlated directly with how successfully and how quickly countries can combat the virus. You just have to look at the US at this point in time. Everybody thought the US would pick up rapidly. Then there was a big second wave across many southern states, and that's depressed the outlook in the US as well. In contrast, China contained the virus quickly, and China is, I think, the only large country in the world which will register positive growth, something like 2.5% in 2020. So as we've discussed before, I think that is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition to have a faster recovery. And so, that's for doctors to decide. But the more we can contain and the sooner we can contain the virus, the more we believe households can begin to normalize their activities and reduce risk aversion.
Let's at that point, Dr. Chinoy, take a break. When I come back, I want to turn to that third critical issue that I said in the introduction I would raise with you. What are the steps that are necessary to take us back, or perhaps at least towards 7% and 8% growth levels? That's in a moment's time after this break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the Chief India Economist of JP Morgan and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Sajjid Chinoy. Dr. Chinoy, let's now come to that critical issue. What are the further additional steps that are necessary to take our economy back to 7 and 8% growth levels? In the essay that you recently wrote for Open Magazine, you say what we need to do is boost demand, and you add this requires fiscal stimulus, and you recommend a large infrastructure push. Let me begin by asking you, what are your reasons for suggesting this infrastructure push?
Well, I think the Indian economy will be contending with at least two paradoxes this year. The first is what I call the paradox of thrift. We spoke about the fact that household consumption was slowing coming into COVID. And so given the COVID shock on incomes and jobs, the expectation is that households will become even more risk averse coming out of COVID. You just had to look at the RBI's consumer confidence survey to see this. Everybody focused on the headline number of confidence falling. I think the really interesting part was when households were asked, where will spending be 1 year from now? Despite the fact that their 1 year ahead projections for employment and incomes had gone up compared to the last round of the survey 3 months ago, they said that they'd be spending even less. And that's understandable. To the extent that households believe this is a permanent income shock, they will adjust their consumption downwards for the foreseeable future. This is the classical paradox of thrift. When you want them to spend more, they'd be spending less. I think something similar will happen in the global economy. We project that in 2021, global output will still be 6% below what it would have been pre-pandemic. And so even though exports may provide some support in the coming months, they're unlikely to be a meaningful driver of growth going forward. So if consumption is not picking up rapidly and exports won't pick up rapidly, why would any private entrepreneur invest? And so when we come back to your four drivers of growth, without strong prospects for consumption or exports or investment, it will be left to the government. So my own sense is that I think the time is ripe in next year's budget to mount a large infrastructure push. This will do several things simultaneously. One is it will boost aggregate demand in the near term. Capital expenditure has large multiplier effects on the private sector and therefore hopefully crowd in some private investment. Remember, infrastructure spending is labor intensive. So hopefully it will be a magnet to attract some of the labor back from the rural economy and fill the vacuum that the real estate sector has left. And ultimately, infrastructure spending is necessary to increase the competitiveness and therefore the potential growth of India's economy. So I think this is a very good time for a big infrastructure spend 2.0, but pre-financed by selling assets, given our delicate fiscal position.
Now, that's a very interesting point on which you went. You said that this big infrastructure push has to be financed by selling government-owned assets, public sector assets. And I presume you're saying this because otherwise the fiscal deficit will balloon to unsustainable levels. Already, as you point out in your Open Magazine article, the combined fiscal deficit of central and state governments is roughly 8%. The public sector borrowing requirement is just over 10%. Presumably, both of these will be further ruined by the collapse in revenues this year. Consequently, the only way you can finance this major infrastructure push is if the government does what you call aggressive selling of public sector assets. So let me ask you two questions about that. At a time like this, when stock market activity is believed to be somewhat subdued, is this the right condition for major public sector sales? Won't the government be accused of selling the family silver cheaply?
Yeah. So one is, as you pointed out, just to make the case for asset sales. Remember, as you hinted, debt to GDP in India at the end of the COVID year is expected to rise from about 72% all the way to 85% of GDP. So it's really important that we don't let debt to GDP rise too much further from that, for it to be stabilized and for it to be brought down, to ensure that credit ratings agencies, investors, markets don't get too nervous. At the same time, we require a big growth push from infrastructure. So this is what I call the second paradox, which is the paradox of fiscal space. We enter with limited fiscal space, and yet the fiscal will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And the only way to square that circle is to look for other sources of revenue. Now, we know that given that it's going to be a gradual recovery, we can't be raising tax rates at this point in time. And so there really is no other option. If you don't want to cut expenditure and you can't raise tax rates when the private sector is recovering slowly, the only recourse you have is to aggressively sell assets. And in fact, the government recently in the month of May did say it was committed to public sector disinvestment and strategic sales, both in strategic sectors and non-strategic sectors. Now, to your point about the timing, well, Karan, if you look around the world, there's a huge gulf between economic activity and asset markets. Equity markets are booming around the world, not just in India, but around the world. Many people say unjustifiably so. The correlation between real activity on the ground and asset prices has completely broken because you've seen unprecedented stimulus from global central banks. I mean, the world is awash with liquidity. So in fact, if there was ever a time to exploit this arbitrage between real activity and asset prices, now is the time. Now, what I'm not proposing is we sell everything in a fire sale in 6 months. Absolutely not. I'm saying we should have a 3-year systematic, institutionalized plan to sell assets at regular intervals, not try and game the market or time the market, and use those proceeds over 3 years to build infrastructure over the last 3 years. Let me end by saying that think of this as being an asset swap on the public sector's balance sheet. You're selling less productive assets and investing that money into higher productive infrastructure assets. So this is not akin to selling your family silver and paying your credit card bill.
Let me put another reason why people like Pranab Sen, the former chief statistician, are deeply skeptical of the government plans to have public sector asset sale. When Nirmala Sitharaman first mentioned this in May, I shortly after that interviewed Pranab Sen, and he said, look, this government's track record of privatization is very weak. First of all, it prefers to sell one PSU to another and calls that privatization. And on the one occasion when it attempted what could have been genuine privatization, Air India, it badly bungled it by putting in ludicrous conditions. So do you believe this government, despite what Nirmala Sitharaman said in May, is actually committed to genuine privatization rather than handing one PSU to another PSU?
Karan, the world has changed dramatically in the last 6 months compared to the last 3 years. So what were, nice to do 3 years ago has become an imperative right now. I would just take hope and comfort from the fact that even before COVID, in the February 1st budget, the government seemed committed to a large disinvestment program this year, including selling some stake in LIC. And to the extent that the finance minister has reiterated that in May, I continue to believe that there's an opportunity there. And I'm saying it because I think the real politic here is that we don't want to cut expenditures going forward, and there is no other way to raise revenues which will not hurt the private sector. So this leaves us with Hobson's choice, which is why I think we'll have to go down this path eventually.
Your Open Magazine article makes two further points that I want to quickly bring up with you. First of all, you stress the importance of the government coming up with what you call a credible medium-term fiscal consolidation plan. Can you explain what does that amount to? Governments, by the way, in India always insist that they have a credible consolidation plan for their fiscal spending. It never turns out to be the case, and they frequently, without hesitation, amend it when they need to do so. So what do you have in mind, and how do you ensure the government sticks by it?
Right. Well, I think this is a larger issue that confronts advanced economies versus emerging markets. You've seen in the last 3 months, advanced economies can wake up in the morning and write a check for 5% of GDP, and nobody bats an eyelid because they've had decades of institutional credibility. Some, like the US, benefit from what's called exorbitant privilege, because we're in a dollar currency world. I mean, think of what happened in 2011. The US got downgraded by a ratings agency, and the dollar actually rallied because that is the safe haven currency. Emerging markets don't have that luxury. They've got to operate under these constraints of capital outflows, ratings agencies, investors, markets. So you've got to thread the needle. And what that means is provide enough fiscal support in the crisis year to hold the economy together, and use fiscal policy judiciously to provide, in my view, this infrastructure boost. At the same time, convince markets, investors, ratings agencies that the government is serious about ensuring that India's debt does not become unsustainable. Right? Now, the way to do that credibly, in my mind, is to institutionalize it, right? So that people aren't skeptical about that. And there are different ways you can do it. One option is to have another fiscal law post-COVID, where we have perhaps another debt target and we have a glide path to get there. The NK Singh FRBM review committee had suggested a fiscal council. Maybe we can have a multi-year asset plan, but we need to have something which is institutionalized to convince the world that the support here is deep, but it's temporary. And in the medium term, India is committed to fiscal consolidation and making sure its debt is sustainable.
Very quickly, let me pick up on that thought about the possibility or the need for a fiscal council. Would that mean that hereafter fiscal targets, or somehow ensuring those fiscal targets are met, becomes a responsibility of the fiscal council and not something that the government can arbitrarily change with each budget?
Karan, I don't want to get too prescriptive about what the council can do. I think the NK Singh committee had some suggestions. There are different models around the world. Some are more advisory in nature, but just some provide inputs to the government in terms of what the path needs to be, what the assumptions need to be every year. But just something to reassure markets that there is an institutionalized plan here to ensure that India's debt in the medium term does not become unsustainable. Because what that does is, the more we institutionalize the return path, the more latitude we'll have to use fiscal policy judiciously in the COVID year and the year immediately thereafter.
Okay, you made one other very important point in your Open Magazine article, and this time it's a suggestion designed to attract firms leaving China and presently relocating to Vietnam, Taiwan, some people even say Bangladesh, and instead give them good reason to opt for India. Your words are, and I'm quoting you, India must quickly reposition itself to become a viable contender. What does it need to do to become a viable contender?
Well, let's just say, we all agree India needs to be growing at 7 or 8% for years and for decades to come. Now, no country in the world has grown for a decade strongly without the benefit of exports. So the real question is, how can India rely on export-led growth over the next decade, even as the global economy is less buoyant and there's protectionism? The only way to do that is to increase our global export share, right? Now, to increase our market share, we will have to break into the Asian supply chain, because ultimately more and more of exports are routed through global value chains. And this is an ideal opportunity, given that the US-China trade war is going to continue for the foreseeable future. More and more multinational companies are leaving China and looking for other destinations in Asia. India must quickly compete to be that alternative. We've had some successes in a couple of large multinational companies the last 2 years, but we need to have, again, a more institutionalized framework. My suggestion is, given that this is a narrow window and time is short, we should go back to a revised special economic zone model, because I think that's easier to implement. Small special economic zones of the kind China employed, where land acquisition becomes easier, labor laws are more flexible, there's world-class infrastructure, already corporate tax rates for new manufacturing are down to 15%. If we do that, Karan, let me end with this. The demonstration effect of the first one or two succeeding are huge. If we can get one or two of these special economic zones to prove to the world that producing in India is as competitive as the rest of Asia, we'll have dozens more companies come. And once one state does it, there'll be pressure on other chief ministers to emulate that model to attract investment, FDI, and create jobs. So I think that is the most practical approach at this point in time.
A very quick question there, Dr. Chinoy. Do you think this government has now decided that the time has come to make labor laws more flexible. It's something it's avoided doing up to now, although it has got a fixed term employment scheme, which some people feel
Yes.
moves in that direction. This government also attempted to make land acquisition easier in 2014-15, and after passing 3 ordinances, gave it up. Now, 6 years later, do you think there is a determination, given the crisis, that we've got to bite these bullets?
I think clearly from what you mentioned, there is a recognition here that for India's potential growth to go back to 7%, we'll have to confront what economists call factor market reforms. That the next set of reforms have to be around land, labor, power, and the financial sector. I'm just saying that it's a bit daunting to reform the entire country at once. So let's start with doing it in these special economic zones to take advantage of this, narrow window of opportunity, and then hopefully from there we can broaden out.
So you think doing it in specified narrow SEZ is much better than what 3 state governments announced? I think they were Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat, that they would revise by ordinance labor laws, but only for 3 years. And we are not sure whether the central government will permit them to do that. But you're saying it's much better to do it experimentally in small SEZs, and when it works there, hopefully
Exactly.
it will become something the rest of the country wants to adopt as well.
Exactly. And just a quick point, I think one other way is, the GST Council has really been a good forum for the center and states to deliver of best practices. Why not we create councils like that for land, for labor, for power, so that states can learn from each other, emulate best practices, and problem solve together. So I think we need structures like that, federal structures like that enable state to state and center to state cooperation.
You end your Open Magazine article with the following 2 sentences of hope, and I'm going to quote them. Unprecedented crises create unprecedented opportunities. India can and must seize the moment. How confident are you that India will? I'll tell you why I ask. There are many moments which India has failed to seize historically. Could this end up another one which we fail to seize? Or are you confident we've learned our lesson? This is a moment we will grasp with both hands.
Karan, I'm hopeful because if you go back to any of the large economic crises India has faced in the last 3 decades, we've ultimately ended up taking advantage of them. 1991 is well known. We had the 97 to 2001 slowdown. And in that time, we had a big infrastructure push, the Golden Quadrilateral. A lot of asset sales and privatizations happened at that point in time. We had the taper tantrum crisis in 2013, but from that came an inflation targeting regime and a monetary policy committee, and inflation has fallen sharply thereafter. We had non-performing assets and the bankruptcy law came in. So I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful because I think the government, has spoken about agricultural reforms, about disinvestment of PSUs. There was some mention about getting more private sector participation into railways as well. I think we need to complement those initiatives with cleaning up the financial system. I think that has to be paramount, pushing infrastructure hard and paying for by asset sales. I think if we can do those things, then we can begin to contemplate 2 or 3 years down the line, sustainable 7% growth. And I'll just end by saying, given the magic and power of compounding, there's a huge difference between growing at 5% for a decade and growing at 7% for a decade in terms of the rise in incomes, in terms of the number of jobs created, in terms of the number of people we can pull out of poverty. So I remain hopeful. This is a moment like no other. We really should be seizing this moment.
All right, Dr. Chinoy, as you say, in a crisis, India always acts. And we haven't had a crisis like this for the last 70 years. And that's one good reason for hoping we will use this opportunity and act. I hope you're right. Thank you very much for this interview. Take care. Stay safe.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Karan.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.